Hello, everyone. Today is March 1st, 2023. My guest today is Dr. Robert Hayes. Rob is a associate professor of nuclear engineering. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Rob.
Good to be here.
So, how did you first get into nuclear how did you first begin realizing that you may want to enter nuclear academia?
So it started because I have a deep love for math and physics. So I did my undergraduate degrees in math and physics. I did a double major. And before I finished, I got married and we had decided to start a family. And I realized if you only have a bachelor's degree, a STEM degree that's not in engineering, there wasn't a whole lot of job opportunities for someone with a degree in math or physics or both. And so at the time, without better opportunities, I went to grad school and got a master's degree in physics, thinking, well, I'll bide my time, try to make myself more marketable by getting an advanced degree. And I found that that did not improve my employment opportunities much, having a master's degree in physics. And I came to realize that even with a master's degree in physics, people with a bachelor's degree in engineering had much higher offering initial salaries than I did, substantially more. And I realized, if I really want to make a living in the STEM field, I'm going to have to get a degree in engineering. But I wasn't willing to give up my love of math and physics. That was just that was no starter. And so I said, well, what discipline out there is going to allow me to keep my love of math and physics and still, make a living uh, without having to compromise any of my values. And lo and behold, at the university I was at, they had a PhD program in nuclear engineering, and I was like, "That's it. That's the one. I don't have. I can do all. I get to keep all of my math and physics, and I get to do engineering, and even better, I get to do energy." And so that was what did it. It was mainly because I had a family and I needed to provide for them, and so I needed a decent discipline with which to do that.
Okay. And nuclear engineering stood out to you particularly versus other engineering disciplines?
Oh yeah, it was the hardest. It had with every other engineering discipline, you're just juggling valence electrons, right? Electrical engineering, civil engineering, mechanical engineering, you're just rearranging materials in some way or another, or somehow doing that. But with nuclear engineering, you're doing all that, plus you got to do it to the nucleus. So you don't have to just deal with materials and atomic physics and electronics and fluid mechanics and all of that. You get all of that. Plus now you have to have nuclear physics on top of it. So it's like, yeah, okay, I'm sold. I'll go there.
Oh, wow. And how was your experience, your PhD experience?
Grad school is stressful. I went gray in grad school. That's where I first started. So grad school is hard, but I loved learning. It's a very intense learning regimen. It's kind of like when you go from say grade school to junior high, or junior high to high school, or high school to community college, and community college to regular college. Every time you do that, it just gets harder and harder and harder. And then grad school, it was just like the ultimate boot camp of academia.
I can imagine. And
Yeah,
your colleagues, I'm imagining, are also very talented and intelligent engineers as well.
that would be how I would characterize them. Yes, very much so.
And so, what within your physics and mathematics disciplines were you able to utilize in your PhD program?
Oh, everything. There are no exceptions. Yeah, you have to use differential equations. You have to use statistics. You have to use linear algebra. Even now, it wasn't back then so much, but now you even have to have artificial intelligence, neural networks. Uh, there really is no part of math and physics that you don't have in nuclear engineering. It's fully integrated.
Okay. And during your time in the program, were you also integrated within industry, or were you solely in academia?
So it was really just academia. It was doing research and academics, coursework and research. That's pretty much it. That's all the grad school was.
Okay. And then I believe you also handled a postdoc, correct?
Not so much. I had a short postdoc that was like less than 6 months, and then I went straight to industry.
Okay. And what did you learn when you transferred into industry?
That in industry, you're very mission focused on whatever the product is that your industry uh, makes, how that industry makes money. That's really the only thing that you get to do research on. If you're a PhD in industry and you want to do research or design or something like that, it's in a very tight little box that industry will pay you to do work in if it supports their mission, which is obviously to make a profit in some way. And where I went to work was the waste isolation pilot plant in southeast New Mexico. It's a geological repository for transuranic waste. It's owned by the Department of Energy, but it's operated by a management and operating contractor, just like all the national laboratories. They're all operated by a commercial entity, and so that same business model applied there, where our product was really, it was funny. It was quality, it was safety, and it was regulatory compliance. That was the main product. And then if we produce that, then we can stick cans in the hole.
Okay.
So it's a very different paradigm.
And was the product also the land itself, or is that not owned by the corporation?
So the land is owned by the federal government. It's in the middle of out west. It's very different than what we have out here out east. Out west, most of the land I would say is under the Bureau of Land Management. It means it's not private; it's public. It's land that you could go out and homestead on. I don't think anybody does any of that anymore because there's no infrastructure. That's why you don't do a homestead there, because we like to have electricity and running water and roads. You know what I mean? And
Yes.
so that's what we're accustomed to. So we don't go out and live there. We'll only live in the towns that are out there. But the point is, there's still vast amounts of land out there that's just out in the middle of nowhere. That's under the BLM, and this was part of that. This was some land out in southeast New Mexico that was very desolate looking. If you went there, you would say, "Man, this is a wasteland." It's it's semi-arid desert, is what it is. And so they had this large. It was 16 hectares of land that was set aside for the waste isolation pilot plant, and it's basically a deep geological repository for transuranic waste. If you go there, there's this huge salt bed where the WIP is. It's about a mile thick of water evaporites from an ancient lake formation. About half of it's calcium sulfate, the other half of it's sodium chloride. And so it's like kind of right in the middle. It's about a half a mile down in the middle of this huge salt formation. And so that's basically to make it sit there until it will decay back into dirt effectively.
The nuclear waste.
Yes.
Okay. And so you mentioned the product that your corporation was selling was safety, risk assessment, making sure that so you can put barrels of waste into the ground.
Sort of. To be more specific, the real main product was safety, quality, and regulatory compliance. That was it. Basically, we had to demonstrate that we were doing everything safe. Everything was done with the highest levels of nuclear grade quality, and that we met all of the regulatory requirements. All the laws, orders, and standards were being met. And then when we did that, then we could stick cans in the hole. But we had to do that with excellence. Sticking cans in a hole with excellence was the final product. Once you met those first three, then the fourth would fall into place.
How do you stick cans in the hole with excellence?
That's a great question. That means that you do not. Well, first you continue to meet the first three: safety, quality, and regulatory compliance, and you do that in such a way that you in no way compromise any of that, so that you're maintaining all of your personnel qualifications, you're maintaining all of your material maintenance requirements, all of your instrument calibrations, all of your refresher training, all of the maintenance upgrades, meeting all of the manufacturer specifications, meeting all of the oversight group recommendations, doing continual audits, both internal audits and external audits, and then addressing all of the audit findings and bringing those to resolution, maintaining stakeholder interface and communication. It's a very long list of things that you do to put cans in a hole with excellence.
Okay. And so, and this, what substance specifically are in these cans?
Oh, transuranic waste. That's largely plutonium contaminated materials. So it's probably no surprise that wherever you see people working, there are trash receptacles there. That's because the second law of thermodynamics is alive and well, and you're not going to be able to do work without creating more entropy. And that disorder often can be found in the form of trash. And when you're making nuclear weapons, some of the trash is going to be contaminated with plutonium. And that plutonium, it falls under the category of transuranic waste. And so the law, there's a Land Withdrawal Act, Congress made a Land Withdrawal Act many years ago, which says that it has to go into a geological repository, which is what the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, also called WIPP, the WIPP, that's what the WIPP does, is it receives that true waste. Transuranic is also abbreviated TRUE. So the true waste goes there to the WIPP.
Okay. And also, you, as well as being an associate professor, you have what I would say, a very entertaining, very interactive TikTok account that you explain how, or you present and also explain how, fission reaction and fission reaction waste aren't only man-made occurrences and man-made materials.
This is true.
And so what is, people may have reservations against nuclear waste, may say this stuff is toxic, we can't have this stuff around, but fission reactions aren't a man-made occurrence, and the consequences of fission reactions, we've actually been living with them our entire life. Is that correct?
Not entirely. So fission, it would be more correct to say not all fission reactions are man-made. So obviously when you have a nuclear reactor, those are man-made fission reactions, but fission is something that Mother Nature has been doing largely since the beginning. And we know that from a place called Oklo, Gabon, where it occurred naturally in the earth. And there's evidence that it may very well have also occurred on Mars. And that's simply due to the fact that there's a differential decay rate between the various isotopes of uranium. The fissile isotope of uranium is uranium-235, and that only has a half-life of about 700 million years. Now, that's really long, but it's short compared to the half-life of uranium-238, which is not fissile. It's fissionable, but it's not fissile, meaning the thermal neutrons can't fission it. In other words, you can't really make a nuclear weapon out of uranium-238 because it's not fissile. But the uranium-238 has a half-life that's about the age of the Earth, about 4.5 billion years. So because the uranium-235, the fissile isotope, has such a short half-life compared to the non-fissile isotope, over the age of the Earth, the shorter half-life isotope has decayed considerably compared to what it was originally. And so today, the natural abundance of the fissile isotope is only about 0.7%. And so if you go back in time far enough, it exponentially increases in concentration closer to what it was originally, where if you go back, say, a couple billion years, it would have had an enrichment that's comparable to what we require to be used in a nuclear reactor today. It needs to be about 5% enriched. We actually have to artificially enrich the fissile isotope in the uranium to get it to work in a nuclear reactor. But that would have naturally occurred about 2 billion years ago. And it turns out that we found at least one uranium ore deposit in Oklo, Gabon in Africa where that did occur, where you can see the fission products are still there in the ground, which was very powerful evidence for how well we could actually predict how spent nuclear fuel would migrate when it was buried, because it actually happened there. Mother Nature gave us an example of what happens. And so we can see how well will a geological barrier retain those fission products in the ground. And we'll see which ones migrate faster, which ones migrate slower, and what we could expect if we did that under different forms of geology. And so, yes, it's true. Uh, uh, Nuclear fission can be a natural event, and it has occurred here on Earth. And in terms of finding a solution for spent nuclear fuel, the National Academies of Sciences recommended back in the 50s that we basically do it the same way that nature did it, which is to bury it. Put it back where it
Okay.
came from.
Did the in the 50s, did we know about Oklogabon and this deposit?
No, that was basically recognizing that you could build surface structures to house it for hundreds of years until the dose rate became substantially lower, but that would not be as rigorous as burying it in a mine. They just simply recognized that if you buried it in a mine and then sealed it off, that would give you a lot more protection than a surface structure like let's say you wanted to put it in something comparable to one of the pyramids of Egypt, for example, right? That would give you plenty of shielding. It would be very robust. It would last a long time, but it would not necessarily last as long in terms of encasing it or entombing it as if we buried it in a formal mine and then sequestered that.
Okay. So a possible alternative that was not taken on was to create a structure above land that would encase the waste.
So that's actually how we do it now. It's just that when you look at all the options, like shooting it off into space, for example, you run the risk that it would that the rocket might detonate on the pad and then make a big mess. And then there's the cost. It's actually fairly cheap to mine salt because it's fairly soft. And so you can cost effectively make a salt mine that would entomb this. I mentioned that it's about a mile thick where the whip is. The actual cross-sectional area for that salt underground salt feature, it's larger than most Western states. There's another one under the Gulf of Mexico that's almost the entire size of the Gulf of Mexico. And so there are these features that are just phenomenally huge, and they're easy to mine once you're in there into the salt. And so it becomes cost effective to do that. You're not really wasting a resource because, like I said, it's a mile thick and it's larger than most Western states. You're not going to run out of that, not in our lifetime. And you just only need a tiny little spot for all of the waste that's been generated. It's just a dot on the map. Literally, it's less than that. And so they just said this is a cost-effective way to permanently remove it from the biosphere until it decays back to dirt. The salt where it's actually was placed is estimated by geologists to be already 200 million years old, and so that's more than enough. It's more than adequate, and that's what they recognized before the Oklogabon discovery was made.
Okay. And this is also in a wasteland that not very close to, or you laugh now.
Well, when I lived there, we used to call it the armpit of Texas, the southeast corner of New Mexico. It's a semi-arid desert. The only time it's really pretty is right after it rains, and then the desert flowers come up, and then it's lovely. Otherwise, it's tumbleweeds and bramblebush and sand. And it's not the pretty sand that you have out here on the Carolina beaches. It's desert sand that has no features. It's like flat. The only mountains you see are the Guadalupes, which is out in Texas, but it's really just flat, and that's pretty much it. I mean, you get cactus. So I mean, I never really found land. It's oil country. So you'll see those what are those called? Those pumping jacks that they have out there, and that's kind of the landscape.
Okay. The armpit of Texas.
That's what we called it, just because it didn't have a lot of natural beauty as far as features. Flat brown grass, spots here and there, cactuses here and there. It's very dry.
Okay. That makes sense. And out of curiosity, when you started your PhD program, was that after the 3 Mile Island incident?
Oh yes, yes, yes. Long
Okay.
after.
And so as a nuclear engineer, how do you feel the United States and the populace, since that incident, maybe how have we been, and what do you think our interpretation of nuclear energy, uh what do you think about the general populace's interpretation of nuclear energy?
Let me put it to you this way. Whenever you have a professional discipline in the United States, every professional discipline that's not arbitrarily small will have a professional society associated with it. Like the dentists had the American Dental Association. Physicians had the American Medical Association. Um, uh, Mechanical engineers had the American Society for Mechanical Engineering, right? And so on and so forth. The nuclear engineers have the American Nuclear Society. And the American Nuclear Society, a few years ago, came out with the 10 biggest grand challenges in nuclear engineering. What are the 10 biggest, hardest things to do? And one of the biggest grand challenges in nuclear engineering was listed as public communication, because the perception is that nuclear is what you see on The Simpsons, and that if it's not in The Simpsons, it's some apocalyptic vision that you might get in zombie games or something, or uh, Hollywood dystopian scenarios, and these are largely driven by nuclear technology. And so with that kind of a perception, given the fact that nuclear is one of the safest forms of energy that you can have per gigawatt hour. So if you want to know how many people die as a result of you having a cell phone, you've got to go all the way back and look at all the mining and milling and manufacturing and transportation and find out how many deaths per cell phone that there are, right? It's going to be some small number, but there are industrial accidents. And that applies for any industry, right? Solar, wind, cell phones, cars, everything. There's a certain number of deaths that occur per product that you get. And nuclear is one of the lowest if you're looking at only energy output. And that's even including Chernobyl. It gets to be the safest if you take Chernobyl out of it. Per gigawatt hour, how many people are dying from, coal? How many people are dying from falling off of wind turbines, whatever, falling off of roofs, installing solar panels. And so not only is it one of the safest energy forms that are out there, it's no greenhouse gases comparable to wind and solar. So it's incredibly safe, one of the lowest greenhouse gas emitting technologies that's out there. And it's also sustainable in the sense that if we chose to do it, we could literally extract uranium from ocean water. The amount of natural uranium that's dumped into the ocean every single year is about 9 times the electrical energy needs of the United States. So, but that would require we extracted all of it. But the point is that there's a huge amount every year that's dumped into the ocean. And if we extracted that, that's replaced every year by plate tectonics. So in fact, if we use that, it would be literally renewable as geothermal, if we did that. If we're going to continue to dig a hole in the ground, that's fine. But we obviously want to reduce even the environmental impact from that. Right, so it's got one of the smallest land uses. In other words, square meters per gigawatt hour. The smallest number of materials that are required, mining and milling, per gigawatt hour. One of the smallest amounts of greenhouse gas emitted per gigawatt hour. One of the lowest accident rates per gigawatt hour, and yet people are terrified of it, and they think that it's this dystopian Armageddon precursor. So that's why it's basically considered the number one challenge in nuclear engineering. How do you address this common perception that nuclear waste is this boogeyman statement that completely justifies all anti-nuclear sentiments? It simply is so hard to overcome all of those stigmas that are out there because they're very well woven into Hollywood narratives and popular conceptions about nuclear energy.
They're very well woven into. You referenced The Simpsons, which, makes kind of a mockery of nuclear power plants.
Mhm.
And um, there is a stigma, maybe not a stigma, but there is a general uh, unease with people about nuclear. I live in Southern California, and the San Bernardino nuclear power plant was shut down within the last several years. And was that the right move, or was that possibly a result of the populace's fear, and truthfully, maybe even lack of education at the end of the day?
That could very well be. I would argue that it is due to it's a term, it's a clinical term called radiophobia, where people are so terrified of radiation that they will literally refuse to get good medical treatment that requires radiation exposure, right? I mean, could you imagine saying, I'm so afraid of radiation, I won't allow you to give me an x-ray even though I've got a broken bone, right? You can become that terrified of radiation that you can refuse critical technology that is involving ionizing radiation or radioactivity, literally.
And you, I saw recently one of your TikTok videos where you mentioned if we don't have some level of radioactivity in our body, we are going to die,
Oh
correct?
yeah. Oh, absolutely. So your body gets water in and out of cells using a mechanism called the sodium-potassium pump. And there's literature that shows that it's not so much that Americans have too much sodium, it's that we don't have enough potassium. We don't have a balance between the sodium and potassium. And so some physicians will actually prescribe no salt to their patients, which is basically potassium chloride, to get more potassium into their body. Well, potassium, like uranium and thorium, is a primordial radionuclide. It's got a half-life that's around 1.5 billion years. So it's like uranium and thorium, and it's got a very long half-life, but because it's got such a long half-life, it hasn't all decayed away and is still here. And so potassium has a gamma emission and a beta emission. That's a higher gamma emission and a higher beta emission than that of cesium, which is the dominant external radiation field from spent nuclear fuel. Cesium is where most of the external radiation dose rate comes from spent fuel once it's ready to go out on the road, after it's cooled off in a cooling pond and sat in a transportation storage cask. And so potassium is naturally radioactive, and you will die without it. You could make the same argument for radon, in the sense that I wouldn't say that you have to have radon to live, but I will say that if you want to get radon out of your life, you're going to have to walk around wearing a respirator, because it has been in the environment since the beginning, and it will be in the environment at the end. But not everything in the environment is something that you can have unlimited exposure to. The same applies with radiation. Just because it's in the environment doesn't mean that you can have an infinite amount of it and be fine. We know that above a certain limit, or above a certain dose, you actually will have measurable increase in cancer probability if you get exposure to levels that are high enough. And so, in terms of potassium, you can say that that is accurate. You will die without potassium. Now, you could argue, well, I want to do isotopic enrichment of potassium and get rid of the radioactive isotope of that potassium. That would be pretty difficult to do if you're going to get it into all of your food, because all of our food uses natural potassium.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
By what? The natural potassium?
It would be difficult to get it in all of your food.
Right. So all of your food comes at some point comes from plants in the soil, right? So you would have to remove all of the potassium from the soil that your plants came in and replace that with isotopically enriched potassium. Good luck with that.
Okay.
Not gonna happen.
No.
I mean, maybe you could try something with hydroponics or something. I don't know, but you're going to have to get your entire food chain to use isotopically enriched potassium to not have potassium 40 present in your potassium.
Okay. And based off of what you said with the gates, that might not even be optimal for health. Is that correct?
It's hard to say. I mean, that would be, it's kind of like we're in the space of saying that we don't believe the deuterated water is healthy to drink. It's probably not healthy to drink, but it would be ridiculous to try to argue that that the body is not, that life is not designed to have trace amounts of deuterated water in our food and drink, because it's basically, as long as life's been around, the deuterated the amount of deuterium in natural water has been a constant. There have been trace amounts of changes over the eons, but there's always been a constant amount, for all intents and purposes, a constant amount of deuterium in the water that we drink. Now, one could argue, well, you don't want to drink pure deuterated water where I've enriched it all to have, instead of hydrogen, it's going to have deuterium. And that might have health consequences if you did that. I don't know. And it would be the same kind of an argument if you used isotopically enriched potassium. It could very well be fine. It might have some subtle changes that we don't know about. Basically, what ends up happening is that the moment of inertia and the molecular weight would change. How that would affect biology, I don't know. That's really not my field. I'm guessing that you'd probably be okay, but nobody's ever done the experiment, so I don't know.
Okay. Understood. So, and you mentioned that there is a level where, if we go above a certain radiation level, our cancer, our risk to cancer may increase. And I believe recently you had a student who released a paper about astronauts and
Yes.
potential risk, and communicating these things. And even some people may not be aware that normal flight holds certain risk of radiation.
So the latter part of what you said is true. Let me address something that you had stated in the first part. What I had stated is there is a dose limit upon which, when you get below that, you can't see any effects. That doesn't mean that there aren't any. It just means that if they are there, they're too small to see. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
And so it's not quite the same thing. The issue that takes place there is that once the dose gets small enough that it's in the noise, that's where people are still terrified of it, and that's a big issue, right? Because if you're afraid of something that's too small to be measured, how much money, fear, and time is it worth to avoid that if it's too small to be measured? I would argue that you're really looking at a zero. If I can't measure it, then and I'm asked what I'm going to spend money on. My professional opinion is I'm going to spend money on something that I can see a difference. If I can spend money on something and I know I'm not going to see a difference, I don't think that makes sense. Not to me professionally or personally. I want to spend money on something I can see is going to make a difference. I want to put food in children's mouths. I want to put clothes on people's backs. I want to put education into people's minds. I want to provide housing for people that don't have it. That makes a difference. I want to spend money on that. I don't want to spend money on a potential medical effect that's too small to measure. And so it very well may still be there, but like I said, it's too small to measure. And that's right around 10 rem, which is well above the regulatory limit for what a radiation worker can get in a year. It's actually half that. And most facilities will go to 2 rem per year as the maximum. And then they'll have an administrative limit that will say only 1 rem per year. And even though they do that, which is 10 times below that statistical threshold, usually you're getting or about a factor of 5 or more less than that on average for your nuclear workers. And so they're incredibly safe, but that doesn't mean that those levels don't terrify people, because you cannot say that it's not real. It's like knocking on wood. Technically, I cannot say that makes a difference. Maybe it reduces your stress levels if you knock on wood and that helps you, right? But is that scientific? I don't know. Maybe it is. Let's ask some sociobiologist or some psychologist or something. They might be able to answer that. But when we're talking about medical effects that we know are too small to see just because of everything else that's out there, there you're talking about some serious ethical issues that you're spending money on that. And that is currently our government policy, is to try to spend. And I would argue, again, if you're going to spend, hundreds of millions of dollars to avoid something like that, I think that we should really seriously question if that's where we want to spend the money, is to avoid those kinds of doses because people are so terrified. Now, what will happen is that people, their terror will spring up, and they'll tell the decision makers, you need to stop that, right? You're killing our children. You're giving us cancer. You're causing all of these diseases because there might be an effect, right? That's technically what you're saying, is you can't say that it's not there. So we should pretend like it's there just to be safe. And I don't have a problem with that, as long as you scale the risk with the resources, right? If it's too small to see, how much resources should be given to something that's too small to see in terms of a health effect versus something that is clearly going to have an effect, like food and shelter and clothing and education and social programs. Those overwhelmingly have an effect, and it's very cost effective to have a very substantial medical effect by putting food in a child's mouth. I mean, it seems that simple. It doesn't cost a lot to feed people, but it does cost a lot to avoid doses that are comparable to natural background.
And not only does it costs a lot, and it hinders a lot of ability to provide more nuclear energy.
It makes it expensive, yes. The two accurate criticisms that you could level against nuclear energy is that since we haven't been building them in 50 years, we're very slow, and it's very expensive. And so it's very difficult to stay on schedule to do something you haven't done in 50 years, and then to try to do it for the first time and be on schedule. It's kind of hard to do. We didn't do it very well at all. The Vogtle units in Georgia were way behind schedule and way over budget. And those are accurate, correct criticisms. But again, they come back to radiophobia, because we've been so terrified of nuclear that we haven't been building them. We haven't maintained that skill set. And so we've got to relearn it. We've got to reteach ourselves to do that, how to do it on time and on budget. And then even on budget, that in and of itself is largely due to making sure that the worst thing that could possibly happen if you have a full nuclear meltdown is that nobody gets hurt. That's how they're designed. And that's why they're also so expensive, even if on budget, because that's the level of safety that's required with modern nuclear energy. And I actually like that. I think that's kind of cool. It's kind of a point of pride that we have an incredible safety culture in commercial nuclear energy.
Yes, it is pretty. I mean, to see something like Chernobyl occur in the United States would be devastating. And do you want to speak?
Oh, I was going to say we kind of did. It's just that our reactors, when we did that, was 3 Mile Island, and it only raised the radiation levels of the inhabitants to about 1% of their natural background for that year.
Okay.
Ours were designed that way. Does that make sense?
Yes, with the very high safety protocols.
Right. That was our version of how to address worst case scenarios. And the reactors we have now are substantially better.
And what reactors do we have now?
Oh, like the Westinghouse, the AP1000s, like that just went into Vogtle in Germany, not Germany, Georgia. Sorry. So the new modern ones, and then even the kind that we use there at 3 Mile Island, all of those were upgraded and improved to make sure that never happens again. And they've been even improved beyond that to make sure that any other potentially unlikely scenario has been adequately mitigated. We use a process to address that called probabilistic risk assessment. And that came out of 3 Mile Island. It was recognized. If we'd done that beforehand, we'd have recognized back then that was a possibility. Even though there were multiple redundant safety features, there was sufficient common mode failures that had a non-negligible probability, but without doing probabilistic risk assessment, we weren't able to identify it. But now we have that. It enables us to look far more comprehensively at all possible sequences of events that could give rise to any kind of an undesirable outcome.
Probabilistic risk assessment.
Yeah, it's called PRA. Yeah.
PRA, and that's a new standard throughout the entire industry after 3 Mile Island.
Yeah, basically everybody adopted it, including other industries. It's so profound and so rigorous that it's largely an industry standard for any complex system.
Okay. And So we spoke about there's a radiophobia within the United States. It has hindered the progression of the industry, new reactors, more modern reactors with better maintenance schedules that are on time, and probably fewer engineers within the United States chose the nuclear route and went into other disciplines simply because, for example, my school didn't have a nuclear program, and maybe if there was less of a radiophobia, it would.
Correct.
That so who knows? But have you seen, or is there any change in the sentiment towards the public, towards the U.S. public in nuclear energy? Have you noticed that?
There is starting to be, according to the polls, as I understand it, there is starting to be a bit of an upswing because of the climate crisis. Because nuclear is such an, I mean, even the International Panel on Climate Change, in their 2018 report, they said we have zero hope of meeting our climate goals unless worldwide we double down on nuclear. We have to have twice the amount of nuclear capacity than we do now, or we're not going to meet our climate goals. So, I mean, that's pretty stark, right? The International Panel on Climate Change said you have to double nuclear or it's over. We're not going to make it. We're going to fall short. And so that's a rather profound statement right there. That's even ignoring all other arguments for nuclear. There just isn't an alternative technology that can meet the base load. You can't get above about 70% of traditional renewables on your grid before you start getting diminishing returns, because when the sun doesn't shine and the wind isn't blowing, you got to supply that somehow, and you don't want transmission lines going from LA to Salt Lake City to supply wind from Salt Lake City to LA when the wind is blowing in Salt Lake City but there's no sun or wind in LA. That makes sense. Those
Yes.
transmission lines would have huge losses, and then there's huge materials cost that it's going to impact environmental stewardship because of all the materials that we would need to do that, to get that small amount of energy to supply that extra 30% baseload that you require to have 70% renewables. And that's assuming that you make it all the way up to 70% renewables. Right now, most people are going with natural gas because it's not as dirty as coal or oil.
Okay, but they're still not as energy efficient as nuclear.
Well, it's cheap. Natural gas is cheap due to fracking. It's just the environmental impact, right? It's a greenhouse gas emitter, and it has a life cycle environmental impact from mining and milling and waste, the CO2 into the environment, that has a bigger environmental footprint than that of nuclear.
Okay, and nuclear's runtime is the highest of all.
The capacity factor, yes, it's over 90%. So most baseload installations like coal or oil or natural gas, they have capacity factors that are much lower. Even hydro does not have a 100% capacity factor. Even geothermal does not have a 100% capacity factor because you have to shut down for maintenance and cleaning and things like that. If you have coal, you're going to have to clean out the reactor, all the residuals and so forth. You got to shut down to do that. And so that's replaced by other baseload on the grid when one is shut down for maintenance. But nuclear has the highest capacity factor of all energy sources, meaning 24/7 energy is coming out of that facility 9 days out of 10. It's basically once a year, once every other year, they have to shut down for about a month to do refueling.
Okay, and what's the material load difference between, say, uranium and how much equivalent coal it would take to supply uh, the amount that a nuclear fission power plant would have?
So let me give you some numbers that are a little easier to visualize rather than spitting out, orders of magnitude numbers. A standard nuclear power plant, a gigawatt plant, would require a core that would have uranium pellets in bundles that would be about the size, about 10 meters on an edge. So think 10 meters on an edge, that's about the size of a nuclear reactor core. And that'll last on average with refueling and shuffling, something on the order of about 2 to 3 years. And that'll produce a gigawatt. So on the order of about 10 meters on an edge. In order to produce the same energy with coal, you're going to need around 100 rail cars of coal per day. per day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. 100 rail cars of coal full per day. So that's just all getting burnt. The effluent's going up the stack. The coal ash is going to turn into mountains of coal ash. And so that's why nuclear has such a small environmental footprint. You just need a tiny amount of materials to make an enormous amount of energy. And that's also why it's also so safe. You don't have to do as much mining and milling and manufacturing to get a gigawatt of energy, a gigawatt hour. And so if you're looking at deaths per gigawatt hour, it has an extremely small number of deaths per gigawatt hour, right? Because you can talk about how many people have to die to make 1 million cell phones. You can talk about how many people have to die to make a gigawatt of energy, a gigawatt hour of energy from the different energy sources, and nuclear is the lowest.
Okay. And there may be 3 incidents that I think I personally reference: 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. One, 3 Mile Island, there were no deaths, and the radiation that the surrounding area was exposed to was equivalent to natural radiation, correct?
Oh, a small fraction of natural radiation, about 1% for the annual dose that you would get. So it was extremely small. It was, if you had an EPA license, it would be a fraction of the regulatory allowed EPA limit. It was a small amount.
Okay. And that's a testament to the culture, our nuclear industry culture here.
Not at the time. That was a testament to safety by design. So it was designed to be able to handle a nuclear meltdown and not hurt anybody. That was the point, right? And so it worked as designed, but we realized that that we could easily design it to be a lot better, and so we did.
Okay. Was there a specific design difference they implemented within 3 Mile Island?
Versus Chernobyl, yeah, we have a containment. We require a containment by law.
Containment of the reactor.
Yeah. So basically, our design is so that if you had a double line break of the coolant to the reactor, in other words, there's no repairing it. There's nothing you can do. All that residual heat is just going to stay and build up until the temperature equilibrates to the heat generation rate, to the heat extraction rate. That temperature is above the melting point of the fuel. That fuel melts, goes to the bottom. The design is that it's going to retain all of that radioactivity in there in such a way that you don't get more than 10 rem at the fence. So if I'm at the fence, I don't get 10 rem, I have no effects at that point, or I'm right at that statistical threshold. So the worst that could happen is that I might just start to approach that statistical threshold. And if I'm downwind the whole time, then that's the criteria for those worst case assumptions. I think back then it might have actually been 25 rem was the design limit, which means that 10 rem is the threshold for children, 20 rem is about the threshold for adults, and a 25 rem, it would just put you over that. So if you were at the fence and you got the 25 rem, then you would have a statistically significant increase in your cancer probability rate on average.
Okay.
And so that was the design criteria that we had, is that was the worst that could happen, as opposed to Chernobyl, where they said, we think our reactor is so safe that we don't need any of that. And we said, well, we respectively disagree. We like to have a higher margin of safety here. We like to have large safety factors. We like things to be inherently safe.
Okay. And there wasn't much communication, I'm assuming, between the US and Soviet Union during the times that they were both creating their own nuclear reactors. We had our own regulatory framework and they developed their own regulatory framework, and then they were
this was what,
sorry, continue.
Oh, this is when the Soviet Union was around. So when they were communist, that was when we still had the Cold War. And so during the Cold War, the Soviet Union really had a driver to make things cheap. And so one of the ways to make it cheap is to not have a containment. Basically, how cheap can you make a nuclear reactor? And safety is not free. It is not free. Safety is going to cost you, but that was just a different criteria with the United States. We were safety conscious. We didn't have PRA capability. If we had, then that would have been mitigated. Um, and so there was little to no communication between the United States and the Soviet Union. And when it came to 3 Mile Island, that was also because we had very poor communication between the regulator, the operator, and the public even back then. So all of that's been readdressed. So we actually have a formal process by which we were able to make accurate and assessed communication to the public and the decision makers from the states, the feds, the local responders, everybody. There's a formal chain of command that you use. It's actually called incident command. It's the same thing that's used for all events that would occur that might threaten public safety. So chemical spills, nuclear spills, anything, it would use the same incident command structure that has formally been adopted and is today used with the nuclear event responding should anything occur again in the future.
Okay, that makes sense. And when you spoke earlier about containments and what a containment, what's the purpose if both inputs of the coolant that go into the reactor are cut off and it's supposed to contain all the radiation, it seems similar to how Fukushima's incident occurred. Is it what occurred? How did Fukushima react to being disrupted?
Oh, so Fukushima did meet our Western standards. It was a Western reactor design in terms of the design. So 3 reactors did a full meltdown, and the containment kept the stuff contained. What did happen is that they did not meet the same criteria that we would use for the cooling pool. So with the cooling pool, we do things like we will checkerboard our bundles so that we put the hotter ones inside and surround that by the cooler ones. As long as you have regular cooling, it's not necessary. It's just like added safety. It's an added margin of safety that you use. Like basically, you just assume that the worst is going to happen, and then you make sure that that's going to be okay. If you don't assume that the worst is going to happen, you're not going to be as conscious about that. And so they had some of their spent fuel in their cooling pond in that configuration where they had hot ones next to each other. And the same criteria that's used to cause a meltdown in a reactor can occur in this cooling pool to a much lesser degree. Specifically, what can happen in the cooling pool is the laws of thermodynamics say if I have a heat generation source, like say a fire in a wood stove, something like that, the temperature is going to increase until the heat generation rate is equal to the heat extraction rate. So when I get the heat extraction rate equal to the heat generation rate, whatever temperature that is, that's the equilibrium temperature you have for a given heat generation rate. And in spent fuel, you have radioactive decay. That's a source of heat that's in there. And so if I'm no longer cooling the spent fuel, basically I boil off the water or I let the water evaporate, then the heat extraction rate goes way down. That makes sense? And if the heat extraction rate goes down, then that means that the temperature is going to rise because the heat creation rate hasn't really changed.
That makes sense.
And what happened with Fukushima was that when that occurred, they didn't have the pumps, they didn't have electricity to keep water pumping in there to keep it cool, that you had this thing called hydrazation. So the zirconium fuel rods were able to, they got so hot that they effectively electrolyzed the water. They were able to convert the water back into, you're able to chemically create hydrogen when you get really, really hot. So the fuel didn't melt, but it did get so hot that the hydrolysis process that was occurring from the extremely high temperatures created hydrogen that floated to the top and created a combustible mix. So when that hydrogen floated to the top of the cooling pond, all it takes is a static discharge and boom. And you have hydrogen and oxygen combining to make water, and that caused that heat that's released causes the expansion, and that's what happened. And so with that and with the melting of the fuel bundles, that created the radioactivity that was released. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So the containment worked, but their process for the cooling pond was something that they thought was safe enough that turned out not to be.
Okay. And what would be the configuration change you think that system would need to have been safe?
Oh, you have to use the checkerboarding approach that we use. So basically, if you have a fresh bundle is surrounded by cold bundles. So that if I have multiple hot bundles next to each other, they'll make each other much hotter because they'll just be pouring heat into each other. But if I put it by cold bundles, then they'll be absorbing the heat and they'll just raise their temperature and help to radiate the heat out. But when I put all of the hot bundles together, basically, I don't, when I take fresh fuel out of the reactor, I don't put it all in a one little pocket next to each other. And then when I take fuel out, I don't put it all in one pocket next to each other. Basically, I have to checkerboard them. So the heat source is dissipated, it's distributed. So it's able to dissipate passively without requiring those active engineering features like
Okay.
the running water.
Okay. And when you say spent fuel, do you mean radiated water?
No, that's the uranium that was used that was used in making the fission reaction. So it's the uranium that was fissioning. Once you in the fission process, you convert uranium-235 into fission products, mainly beta gamma emitters. And so those are little ceramic pellets that go into these cylindrical rods, which are bundled together in a square lattice, and that's called a bundle. And then you'll put a number of these bundles in a reactor core that will be around the size of 10 meters on an edge. It's actually more of a right circular cylinder. But then these bundles, when they've used their fuel, when they don't have enough of the uranium-235 left to maintain criticality, then once every other year or so, you'll take some of the old ones out and you put some fresh ones in, and then you'll juggle the ones in the reactor to try to optimize your fuel loading, basically to get a nice high, a constant reaction rate flux across the core radially. But then the fuel that no longer has enough uranium-235 in it, it's called spent fuel, and that goes off into the cooling pond so that it can cool down until it can be then put into dry storage in a transportation storage cask for eventual disposal in a geological repository.
Okay. And using the checkerboard configuration when they're cooling, then they can cool in their pockets of cooler areas where they can dissipate that heat more effectively.
Right. It'd be like having 4 or 5 wood burning stoves, and you put them all close to each other. In the center, it's going to be a lot hotter than if I separate them out and put cold wood burning stoves in the midst of them. And the maximum temperature you're going to get is going to be drastically lower than if I concentrate all of the stoves with a fire in it next to each other.
Okay. And so how many deaths were a result of Fukushima's incident? And this was in 2011, correct?
I don't remember. I thought it was 2014. It might have been 2011.
It might have been 2014.
No, 2011 sounds right. Yeah, 2014 was when the WIP had their event. Okay, I'm getting those.
Valentine's Day.
Yes.
We'll have to talk about that afterwards.
Okay. So technically, there were no deaths. There was one gentleman that got lung cancer, and it was part of the cleanup. And the legal liability is not the same thing as scientific causality. Lung cancer is not something that is a common effect from exposure to ionizing radiation, external ionizing radiation. Usually, it's going to be leukemia. That's going to be the most common thing. That's what occurred in Chernobyl. But if a guy gets lung cancer, that's something that will naturally occur, and legally, the company was held liable for that. But scientifically, you could say that nobody died from it, except for those that died in the panicked evacuation. So radiophobia strikes again. That tends to be the biggest killer for nuclear energy. There were a few thousand people that died in the panicked evacuation. And whether that was due to the tsunami or due to Fukushima. Largely, it's attributed to the panic from Fukushima. People were afraid of the radiation, and so they lost their lives trying to avoid something that would not have had a measurable medical effect. The actual evacuation criteria that we use in the United States is that if you can get between 1 and 5 rem per year from contamination, that the EPA has the right to issue evacuation orders. And usually they'll do it at least around 2 rem per year. But they can do it at 1 rem and issue evacuation orders for radioactive contamination if it's at the level that can give you a rem per year. Now, to put that in context, a rem is about what you get from a nuclear medicine scan or a CT scan to the hip or chest or head or something like that. And so it's not a massive dose. It's actually a legal dose for a radiation worker. But because the people didn't ask for it, the current policy is that if people didn't ask for that, then you need to be much more conservative in preventing them from being exposed to it. But Fukushima is a good example of that doing far more harm than trying to inform the people, allowing them to make an informed decision, because then it won't be panicked evacuation, it will be trickled. People will decide, maybe today or tomorrow or the week after that they're going to move, but it's not all going to be, you have to move now, right? Because that creates a panic, and that killed a lot of people in Fukushima. And so even in Chernobyl, it turns out that the research shows that even in Chernobyl, it looks like that happened again, that more people are dying from radiophobia than from the actual radiation exposures. There was a study of some Estonian cohorts that were part of the cleanup, and they were looking at them. They were all part of the Chernobyl cleanup, and they found no statistically significant changes in any radiogenic diseases at all. So basically, their disease rate was the same before and after Chernobyl. However, what they did find was a massive spike in suicides.
Wow.
What happens after you get exposed to low-level radiation? And it happened at 3 Mile Island. It happened with Fukushima. People will start blaming any medical effect that they have on the radiation. So if you have arthritis, if you have poor hearing, if you have a bad back, if you have any medical problems at all, it's easy to say, oh, well, obviously that was from Chernobyl, right? Just like got this magical property that can make things happen, like bad things. And so you've got that going against you. Plus, you've got the stigma. People will say, ooh, you're exposed to Chernobyl radiation, don't touch me, right? Ooh, you're a Chernobyl boy or whatever. And so you get a stigma, you get the self-reinforcing prophecy that you have no hope. Anytime something bad happens, that proves that you have no hope because that was due to Chernobyl. And so the suicide rate just skyrocketed, which means that if that also applies to all other people exposed, that again, the main cause of deaths in the nuclear industry is fear of radiation.
Wow. And so it seems like, if we disregard fear of radiation, deaths within the nuclear industry may have only, is there more than one occurrence? I mean, we have the 2 bombs within World War II. We have the Chernobyl event. I believe that was 1986. I'm not 100% sure. But are there any other events of wide-scale radiation having been? There are.
Yes.
What are those events?
Well, there are the radium dial painters. There's the uranium miners. The radium dial painters were ladies that would paint radium into glow-in-the-dark paint, or they would put radium in glow-in-the-dark paint and then paint like clocks or aircraft instrumentation so the pilots could see it even when it was dark, because the radium would cause it to luminesce 24/7, so it would always be glowing in the dark. The uranium miners, they were mining uranium where there was very high levels of radon, and so they had statistically significant increases in lung cancer from breathing very high levels of radon due to poor ventilation. And so early in the history of nuclear technology, there were those kinds of events. Yes.
Okay. But okay. And those were very early. And
Mhm.
I think one thing people don't, when they think about nuclear energy, combustible engines, those weren't the safest machines, for all of history. I'm imagining within the invention of combustible engines, there were several incidents that took people's lives or left people physically scarred as well. And it seems like with nuclear reactors, there hasn't been as much disturbance because we are taking huge precautions.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, I do believe combustible internal combustion engines still rank in the top 10 for cause of death in the United States from traffic accidents. So internal combustion engines um, are moving weapons.
Yes.
They're very lethal. They can be very lethal.
So people should just keep aware that, they're driving lethal weapons, and, keep that in mind when, thinking about nuclear energy and where, its safety.
You could. I mean, that makes sense. I would argue that that happens to be something that is definitely easily preventable if you are able to minimize the amount of unsafe driving that you have. Like taking public transportation will improve a lot of things. Driving defensively will improve a lot of things. Maintaining very good alert, uh, being aware of your surroundings when you're driving will help. But keep in mind, even with all of that, you could be doing all of that, and a deer could jump out and go through your windshield. And I mean, there is a level of risk that's associated with driving that we incur when we exercise our privilege to drive.
Yes, that is true. And it's not negligible, but, we live with that risk every day. And there are a lot of risks within, nuclear energy that are much lower that we are unwilling to accept.
Oh yeah, that's very true. Especially like when it comes to linear no threshold, it's saying that it's possible that any exposure to radiation can cause cancer becomes a technical basis in many people's mind. I would say wrongly to say that there is no unreasonable limit to how much money you should spend to avoid that.
And that's not true. You mentioned earlier food in children's mouths, clothes on people's backs.
It's an
Well,
easy
go.
way to make easy way to make a difference for pennies on the dollar. You can make a huge change in people's lives. Yes, absolutely.
Yes. And so to kind of shift, Rob, one other interesting fact that you present is you grew up in a environment, you grew up in Utah, I believe, which is,
I'm gonna turn
a
the light
theist,
on. Go ahead, I can hear you.
which is a, theist environment, but you also had an anti-theist influence, and it seemed like that dichotomy may have influenced you as you grew up. Is that
Sure.
true?
Sure.
How did that influence you? And
Um,
today, sorry, continue.
oh, did you have a question you wanted to?
Oh, just also, you mentioned Christianity
Mhm,
within your posts
mhm.
and your value of Christianity. And so a lot of people disassociate science and religion. And so also how, what's your perception of their relationship?
So for me, I know plenty of other scientists who are Christians. It's not uncommon. But I would say what what we tend to gravitate on is that. Well, all right, let me put it a different way. There are people in this world who think that the only questions that are worth asking are why? Why are we here? Why should you do good? Why should you be moral? Why should we can be concerned about what happens to us when we die? why, right? And those people tend to be very religious, in my experience. And then you have people that are extreme in thinking the only questions that are worth asking are how. How does the universe work? How does my body work? How does my conscious work? How does the earth work? And so forth. And if you get to that extreme, you can say that those people tend to be fall into the group of what appears to be like atheists or people of that nature that think that religion is evil. Um, in my opinion, it seems that most people, including scientists, are somewhere in the middle, where we like to know why and we like to know how. And for me, they're both just as important. I want to know why and I want to know how. I want to know, why do I exist? What is the purpose for my existence? What happens to me when I die? Why is the universe the way that it is? But it's also very important for me to know how. You know, how does the universe work? How does the nucleus work? How do atoms work? How do materials work? How does cells work? How does life work? How does consciousness work? How, and to me, they're both very important questions, and I don't think that it's healthy to divorce them. That is strictly my opinion. That you really need to have both of those to be able to really understand uh, ourselves. My opinion.
What do you think happens if a person chooses just one of those two?
You go to an extreme where you think that everybody needs to agree with you, and that anybody that disagrees with you is somehow evil or bad or less than.
Okay. Well, Rob, thank you so much for the time. Are there any last words you'd like to mention to our audience regarding nuclear, regarding how and why, anything at all?
Well, I guess the only thing I would add is that if you want to study nuclear, we have an undergraduate nuclear engineering program at North Carolina State University here in Raleigh, in North Carolina. And we have a graduate program. We're actually the first academic nuclear engineering program on the planet. Back then, we were a program in engineering physics, but we also had the first academic nuclear research reactor at NC State. But we have the #1 online Masters of Nuclear Engineering degree program here at NC State. It's been #1 in the nation for many years, and you can get that master's degree completely online. It's the same degree whether you're here on campus or off campus. Some things are a little more challenging off campus. There are some courses, like some lab courses, you can't take, but you can still get the same degree off campus, and you still have to meet the same research requirements. But if somebody wants to study it, we also now have a graduate certificate available online in health physics or radiation safety and radiological protection. So if you're interested in studying more and you want a formal academic credential for it, NC State's the place to go. How's that?
That's great.
Okay.
My guest today has been Dr. Robert Hayes. Thanks for coming on the podcast, Rob.
You're more than welcome. Thank you, sir.